Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, Executive Editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with 10 essential string quartets for beginners. Now, the string quartet falls into the category that we call chamber music. That is, music for small forces. This includes music for solo piano, music for a string quartet, which is 2 violins, a viola, and a cello. Those are your normal 4 people. Or any other group, piano and violin, piano and cello, a string trio, which is just a violin, a viola, and a cello, quintets, sextets, piano trios, all kinds of, anything that's in small groups that you could play in a chamber, which of course in those days you were dealing with, aristocratic palaces. I mean, big rooms with even people who were poor, unless they were really poor, usually had a stable and servants' quarters. I mean, you needed more space back then. You had to store your firewood for the winter. Life took up room. I mean, nowadays when you order in and everything's electronic and, you can live in a cubby hole in the city and spend a fortune on it. But back in the old 18th century, it didn't work that way. The population was much smaller and things were far more expansive because you traveled by horse, you had animals in the middle of the city, you had, So yeah, a chamber work would usually be played in a what we would consider a fairly hefty room in an aristocratic palace. But it could also be played in the king's bedroom, which usually slept about 20 people at a time, and all kinds of stuff like that. The one thing that you need to keep in mind with this about the string quartet, and this is really, really, really important, is that although it's written for a small number of players, it is not small music. It is music in large forms. The forms are big. The ensemble is small. So in other words, a string quartet normally is just as long as a symphony or a concerto or any of the big forms that you usually see being played by a full orchestra. There's no difference in terms of the form, the shape of the music, the variety of the music, the emotional intensity of the music. The only thing that's different is the number of people who play it. And that is the most important thing to know. And the reason it isn't just because, I don't want you to come to the string quartet expecting one thing and hearing another. It's so important. It's so important to think of music in terms of form and shape and structure, the kind of thing it is, rather than how many people do it as the determinant of what it's going to be. Now, because the string quartet uses only 4 players, it obviously will be less colorful than a piece for full orchestra. But that doesn't mean it will be less profound or less musically significant. In fact, the string quartet became, over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries, the vehicle for what many regard as the most profound musical thoughts. And the guy who did it, who invented them, was Haydn, who invented everything, basically, the father of the symphony and of the string quartet. He wrote 78 and a half of them or so, or somewhere around there, 83 and a half, I think. Was it 83 and a half? He wrote a lot. Somewhere in the late 70s and upper 80s, I wrote a book about Haydn. I shouldn't have these numbers, but the numbers went out of my head. The music didn't. But it's a lot of string quartets. It's in the low 80s, I think. And then Mozart, who wrote a couple of dozen, of which about 12 are really fabulous. And Beethoven, whose 16 string quartets, established the medium as the ultimate in musical sublimity, sublimosity, sublimation, whatever. Listen, that's not what's important. What's important is whether or not you like the music, whether you enjoy the music. And you can enjoy it because it's just enjoyable, or you can enjoy it because it's the most transcendental experience you've ever had in your existence on this mortal orb. It doesn't matter. The point is to listen to it because it's gorgeous, gorgeous music. And so I have 10 quartets here that I think are absolutely iconic and emblematic of what the medium can do. And if you like them, there will be lots more usually, or oftentimes, put it this way, by the same people. So let's get started. I have two by Haydn, numbers 1 and 2. And the reason is because, first of all, Haydn was so important in the development of the string quartet, and he wrote so many of them, that he deserves more than one spot. And second of all, the two I've chosen are in the same key, that is G minor, G major, G minor, and they allow you to hear his development as a composer from an earlier work to a later work. But the early work is very, very important. It's the string quartet in G minor, opus 20, number 3. Now, in case you're wondering what that means, opus numbers simply mean work number. You know, a composer writes a work, or a group of works in this case, and he gives them an opus number. In this case, the opus number was given by Haydn's French publisher. Haydn had nothing to do with it. And then within that opus, within that work, that larger work, there are 6 individual pieces, 6 individual quartets, each of which has 4 movements. So it's a lot of music. And they're all in different keys, but the one in G minor is extremely passionate and powerful. And by general consensus, the Opus 20 string quartets, which were nicknamed the Sun Quartets because they were published with a big picture of the sun on the cover of the music, the Sun Quartets were the pieces that established the string quartet as the major, mature form of classical chamber music. And that is a big, big deal. And this particular quartet is one of the most passionate and powerful of the 6. They all are. They're all amazing works. They really are. But this is where the universe of string quartets kind of gets started. Now, Haydn had 24 regular string quartets and about a dozen quartet serenade type lighter pieces even before he got to the Opus 20 quartets. And some of those are marvelous. I mean, they're beautiful, beautiful music. They really are. They're all good. Haydn wrote no bad or boring music. He really didn't. But Opus 20 was a milestone, let's just put it that way, in the development of the string quartet medium. And it's the milestone that all other composers who came after Haydn took sort of as their model. There were other schools of quartet writing, by the way. I've talked about some of them. Boccherini, the Italian composer, was a wonderful quartet writer. His style was totally different. And that's a topic for another day, let's put it that way. So Haydn's Opus 20, number 3 in G minor. Now, after that, he wrote the Opus 74, number 3. Now, there are only 3 quartets in Opus 74 because he wrote 6, actually, but they were published as 2 opera. Opera is the plural of opus. Get it? You know, opera, the opera means works, lots of different things put together. Okay, so Opus 74 was the second half. Opus 71 was the first half, and each of those have 3 quartets. Opus 74, number 3, has a nickname. Their nickname is the Rider. No one knows exactly why it's called the Rider. It's either because of the opening of the quartet or the opening of the finale, because they sort of have this galloping sense. But the Rider Quartet is in a totally different world from the Opus 20 in G minor quartet. The very opening is one of the strangest things you'll ever hear in any quartet. It goes meow 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 meow. Very weird. Very, very weird. I mean, you've never heard a string quartet make those sounds. And then the finale may be the Rider movement. It goes like that. It does sort of have this sort of, you're on a horse going like that. And so I buy it. I buy it. The Rider is good, but it's a completely different style of writing. It's grander, it's more audacious in some ways. It's not more emotionally pungent or powerful. In some ways, it's actually a little bit more ambiguous because some of the music, is just so quirky. But the two works go a long way towards sort of giving you a what's this thing? Some feeling for the boundaries of the medium, what it can do. and what it can do in the hands of a genius. These are just wonderful, wonderful works, and all I can say is just go listen to them and have a great time, because you will. Next, Mozart. Now, Mozart, who heard Haydn's Opus 33 quartets, the next ones, which are called the joke quartets, the scherzi quartets, because Haydn replaced the normal minuet with something he called a scherzo, which means joke. And Beethoven took off with that later, replacing the minuet generally and everything with something called a scherzo, and the rest is history, because so did everyone else. Anyway, Mozart's quartets, he wrote 6 of them. He wrote a bunch of early ones, all based on some early works of Haydn, too, or similar things like that. But then he heard Haydn's Opus 33, and he certainly knew Haydn's Opus 20s, and he just went, wow, ooh, baby. And so he wrote 6 quartets dedicated to Haydn. And this was fascinating because, Mozart was trying to make a living as a composer, but these quartets had nothing to do with money. They were written out of love, out of affection, admiration of one great composer to another. And when Haydn heard them, and he played them, by the way, Haydn played viola or violin, as did Mozart. He told Mozart's dad, Leopold, famously, that your son is the greatest composer known to me. That was really quite generous of him, given who Haydn was. And the two became very, very close friends, even though they were a full generation apart. Haydn could have been Mozart's dad, but they became extremely close because they were the 2 greatest composers alive working in Vienna, and they knew it. They really knew it. I did a video on the friendship between Haydn and Mozart. You may want to have a look at it. It's a fascinating topic. So the string quartet I have chosen by Mozart is quartet number 19. It's in C major, Kerschel. Remember, Mozart has K numbers identifying his works. 465. And it also has a nickname, which is incredibly helpful. The Dissonance Quartet. It's called the Dissonance Quartet because if you listen to the introduction, it's in C major. You'll never know it. It has this very strange and spooky sounding introduction, which actually is another tribute to Haydn, because if you remember, Haydn's G minor quartet also has a very strange introduction, although it actually came after Mozart's. But Haydn was no stranger to strange introductions, and Mozart didn't write them all that often. Mozart usually just got started with his main theme. That was his, usually he just began, right with the big tune at the beginning. But here he writes a whole introduction, and then the rest of the quartet, the air clears, and the rest of the music is not so alarming. But one of the things you'll notice immediately with Mozart is that when he wrote his quartets dedicated to Haydn, they are bigger. They're longer. They're longer because Mozart tends to write very long-breathed themes. Melodies. He was the vocal composer par excellence. His music always sings. And so he writes melodically generous music. Usually in his first movement, you'll have 2 really well-developed subjects, meaning 2, in this case, usually 2 big, long tunes. And his slow movements, too, all this lyrical, beautifully lyrical music, gorgeously supported by incredibly expressive and affecting harmony. And so Mozart's works are big. Mozart, he has this reputation. He's a classical guy, and we think classical is kind of cute and little. Mozart is not like that. Mozart is in many ways larger and more expansive even than Beethoven. And his quartets, his chamber music, they're some of the largest works in the medium. And so keep that in mind. Listen to Mozart for that big lyrical line. And that's all you need to know, that it's gorgeous and it has wonderful tunes. And those tunes breathe and take their time. And you should too. There's no rush. No rush at all. After Mozart, we have to talk about Beethoven, whose 16 quartets are sort of the Bible of quartet writing for most string quartets in the universe. You cannot be a string quartet and not play the Beethoven quartets. And the best ones to get you started in the Beethoven quartet universe are the middle quartets, numbers 7 through 10, basically, because there are 16 of them. The late quartets are sort of a world of their own. and they were considered very, very strange and almost impenetrable by contemporary audiences and critics when they were written. Nowadays, we play them and we all nod and go, yes, of course, it's profound, it's sublime, it's late Beethoven, but do we like it? That's something for you to decide. I'm not saying it's not lovable. It's fabulous music. There's no question about that. But it's not easy music. Neither, interestingly, are the early Beethoven quartets. Beethoven was quite cagey as a young composer. He stayed away from things because his teacher was Haydn. And Haydn didn't die till 1809 when Beethoven was almost ready to get into his late period. So when Beethoven was first starting out, he tended to avoid things that other composers had done and done better. He was very, very careful. He was very, very careful writing his first symphonies, his first piano concertos, and chamber music particularly. When he finally wrote his first string quartets, he was determined he was going to be as hard, musically dense as possible. And they are dense. I find them a little bit too dense sometimes. And so the middle quartets, where he finally got his mature style going, he was able to relax a little bit. We learn from actually Beethoven's quartets, and this is a really significant lesson. String quartets are often called, Goethe's famous phrase was a civilized conversation between four people, and they're supposed to have, because they're all strings, all members of the same family of instruments. You can have counterpoint. You can have a lot of interweaving musical lines, and some people think, well, it's four equally important voices, which means all four of them have to do something equally important all the time. And that is a mistake. That is not true. You can't listen to a Haydn or Mozart quartet for 10 seconds and believe that that's what's going on. What a string quartet is, and this is really something you'll hear if you listen to the early Beethoven quartets than his middle ones, which are bigger and grander and obviously more mature and advanced in terms of musical style, but they're not thicker. And that's the point than the earlier quartets, because they don't need to be. In a string quartet, all of the voices are potentially equal. Any instrument at any time can take the melody, take the accompaniment. They can cooperate in every possible way, but also in every combination. So you may hear duos or trios or parts where all four of them are doing something. There are very few passages where there is not a clear melody with everybody else subservient. You should not go into your quartet adventure thinking that you're going to hear four people constantly sawing away. And actually there are composers who kind of took it that way because they felt that they were intimidated, and they thought that unless they gave everybody something to do all the time, there was something wrong. And the result is fairly monotonous, actually, not as successful as the great quartet writers. So just keep that in mind, too. Something to keep in mind. So the Beethoven I chose is the Opus 59 number 1, which is the Razumovsky Quartet number 1. They're called the Razumovsky Quartets because they were dedicated to a Russian nobleman named Razumovsky, who commissioned them from Beethoven. There are three, on the condition that Beethoven add a Russian tune in every single movement. Somewhere in every quartet, not in every single movement. And Beethoven did that. And you can listen to the Russian themes where they occur. But the most noteworthy thing about these quartets is simply their bigness of gesture and their confident emotional expression. The opening of this quartet has one of the most beautiful cello themes you've ever heard. Just do 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 ba ba bum ba dum. It's just gorgeous. The rest of the strings just going chuk 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 chuk. But the cello leads, not the first violin, which is what normally happened in these pieces. Beethoven is already starting to insist on the equality of the instruments without insisting that all of them play everything all at the same time. And that we can hear in the first 10 seconds of his Razumovsky Quartet number 1. So after Beethoven, Schubert. Ooh, Schubert. Schubert also wrote a whole passel of string quartets. 13 of them, I think, 13 or 14 or 15, or there's a bunch of them, 15 actually. And number 14 is called Death and the Maiden. It's in D minor. Ooh, baby. Schubert was another composer. I mean, he was only 31 when he died, and he was hugely unsuccessful as a composer, and he wrote music because he had to. I don't mean had to make money. I mean, he had to. It just came out of him in every possible shape, size, and form. He's known, of course, for writing something like 800 songs, hundreds and hundreds of songs, amazing, amazing songs. And Death and the Maiden was one of those songs. And it became the subject of some variations, in the slow movement of the Death and the Maiden Quartet, hence the nickname. But this is just a beautiful work, another piece that's incredibly emotionally intense, but also in an intimate way. One of the things about chamber music is because it's for small forces, it has a certain intimacy. It's also written not even for an audience sometimes. I mean, the audience is there, we listen to it, but we're eavesdropping. We're eavesdropping on an act of communion amongst the performers, who are in some ways playing for their own joy and love of music. And you hear that in the best string quartets. There's that feeling of intimacy, because it would be rather foolish, let's face it, for a composer to write a quartet that's supposed to be as public as a symphony. I mean, they're just not. They really aren't. There are quartets written for public performance. Haydn wrote some at the end of his life, for example. Certainly Beethoven's, and other composers since. I mean, they're on a bigger scale, and they can work in a hall. But nowadays when we have our own concert life, we see string quartets playing at like Carnegie Hall. It's ridiculous. There's a small hall next to Carnegie Hall called the Weil Recital Hall. And there's also Zankel Hall underneath. These are all smaller venues that are much, much better suited for the performance of chamber music. Why? Because in a smaller room, a quartet can be loud. It can be soft. Believe me, you got to be there. You got to be close to it to get all of the nuances. And recordings, of course, do that for us, which is what makes them wonderful. And so when you listen to these quartets, you'll hear a certain intimacy of expression that you just don't get. You just don't get in larger works. And that's what really makes them special. It's why you listen to a string quartet and a symphony, not expecting the same thing, each for its own individual glory. So Schubert's Death of the Maiden, it's a biggie. A wonderful, wonderful piece. Next, Mendelssohn. You know Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn wrote the Italian Symphony, da-da-dum, ba-da-dum, ba-da-da-da-dum, the Wedding March, da-da-da-da-dum, bum-bum, ba-da-da-dum, ba-ba-da, from A Midsummer Night's Dream. Mendelssohn was a superb composer of chamber music, and his second quartet is actually his first, but it was published in reverse order or whatever. His second quartet, it's in A minor, opus 13, is absolutely one of the most powerful and profound quartets anybody ever wrote. It's an extraordinary piece of music. It's in one big continuous span, and it's in cyclical form, meaning it has recurring themes that pop up, along the whole length of the quartet. It's really sophisticated, incredibly sophisticated piece of music, formally. And that doesn't mean you should be intimidated by it. What it means is that you should listen to it. I listen to it many times. I listen to it carefully with open mind and open heart, because it's just beautifully expressive. And like the Schubert, it has some melodic material that's based on a song, a love song, of course. And so there is a strong vein of passion and also melancholy running through it. It's an exquisite piece of music that's not well known. It's not as well known as these other quartets for some reason. It's very strange. Part of the reason is that Mendelssohn kind of has a reputation as a Victorian gentleman, a kind of limp-wristed dandy who had a sort of Victorian propriety inhibition type thing going. But he didn't, and he really didn't in his chamber music. And he really didn't in his chamber music in his second string quartet. It's incredibly expressive and passionate work, and just glorious from start to finish. So give it a shot. I guarantee you'll love it. So after Mendelssohn, we're going to go to quartet autobiography, Smetana. Smetana, the great Czech nationalist composer whose most famous work is Ma Vlast, My Country, a sequence of 6 gorgeous tone poems, the most famous of which is the second, Vltava, the Moldau, the river, whose principal theme became the Israeli national anthem, actually. It's do 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 do. Yeah, you know that one? They're all based on the same sort of Slavic tune. I don't know if the Israeli one is based actually on Smetana. I don't think so, but it's all the same family. Anyway, Smetana wrote 2 string quartets, and the first is called From My Life, because his life was very, very tragic. He went deaf. He suffered from a severe case of tinnitus. He heard a high E squealing in his ear all the time. And in this quartet, we have a sequence of mood pictures of the first 3 movements. But then in the finale, all of a sudden, in the middle of a festive finale, the music stops dead and the first violin plays E, and the other instruments respond with a horrified shudder. And the music goes on from there. And it's another unbelievably expressive piece. And it's one of the most telling and vivid examples of the fact that the string quartet is, first of all, a medium that expresses music of great intimacy, but also of great passion, a great range of expression. Just because the forces are small, it doesn't mean the emotion is any less intense than you'll hear in the biggest of orchestral pieces. You just have to get used to the scale in which those incredibly intense emotions are going to be expressed. And so the Smetana From My Life Quartet, it's a great introduction to string quartets in general, actually. I know I'm taking this kind of chronologically, but if you're looking for a place to start, you might want to start with this quartet because it's so gripping and so immediately vivid and moving in its detail. And it has a story that we know, and that we can trace the emotional progression of the music leading up to that great tragic moment in the finale. And it's devastating. It's really emotionally devastating. A tremendous work. After Smetana, we have to talk about Dvorak. Now, Dvorak was one of the 3 great chamber music composers in the second half of the 19th century. Those 3 were, 4 really. I mean, if I want to be really specific, those 4 were Brahms, Dvorak, the Frenchman Gabriel Fauré, and Camille Saint-Saëns, the other French composer. They really wrote most of the great 19th century chamber music, or a lot of it. And Dvorak was the greatest quartet writer of all of them. Brahms is problematic in his string quartets. Brahms is one of those guys who I mentioned earlier, who is a little bit nervous and a little bit intimidated by the quartet medium, probably coming after Beethoven and Haydn, who Brahms admired tremendously, and Mozart, who Brahms admired tremendously. And his quartets I find rather thick and busy. There are only 3 of them. Brahms reportedly wrote more than 20, but he destroyed all of them except for those 3. They're not bad pieces of music, of course, but Brahms didn't write any bad music. He wrote extremely finished and polished music, but they can sound a little bit careful and sometimes a little bit inhibited. As for Fauré, well, he only wrote 1 quartet at the very end of his life, and it's a very strange work. And Saint-Saëns also wrote a couple quartets, which are lovely. They're beautiful, beautiful pieces. But Dvorak wrote 14 string quartets. Not all of them in the same sort of, exalted vein. He started life writing chamber music. There are some very early ones, but some of the early ones are really kind of cool, like the 4th quartet, which is kind of like the Mendelssohn. It's a big single movement exordium that lasts over half an hour. It's quite a piece. But Dvorak's great quartets, generally speaking, begin with number 8 or number 9, somewhere in there, number 9 probably, which is dedicated to Brahms. And after that, he wrote a piece called the Slavonic Quartet, which is his quartet number 10 in E-flat. It's called Slavonic because it's based audibly on the patterns of Slavonic folk music. Dvorak almost never quoted folk melodies. He was too great a melodist for that. He invented his own, and they were better anyway, and certainly better suited to his purposes of creating music in large forms. So there are some very, very famous Dvorak quartets. Most famous is his number 12, subtitled The American Quartet, because he wrote it during his period in the United States when he was on his summer vacation in Spillville, Iowa. which is where the quartet number 12 came from. But number 10 is an absolutely lovely work of romantic nationalism. That idea of romantic music expressing a particular culture, a place, an ethnicity, and oh my goodness, it's so colorful and sunny and gorgeous, and you'll just love it. It's got one great tune after another. And next, we go to France, because I ignored Fauré and Saint-Saëns, so I apologize to them. Debussy. Debussy wrote one little quartet, just one. And so did Ravel, who is our number 10. They each wrote one quartet, and they are so famous, both of them, as the single quartets. There's value in scarcity. The single quartets of their composers, they usually come coupled on the same disc if you buy CDs, or even if you're looking at programs to download, you'll see Debussy and Ravel, Ravel and Debussy. They actually don't sound terribly much alike. The only thing that they have in common is their second movements are both scherzos, and they both begin with very colorful string writing, pizzicato, plunk, 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 plunk. That's the Ravel, plunk, 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 plunk. And the Debussy is plunk, 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 ya ta ta ta, ba da ta 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 ta, plunk, 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 bum ba 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 ba, like that. I mean, don't trust me. Just listen to them. They're both extremely beautiful. I mean, really, really beautiful works. And the most famous quartets to come out of France, because they're both masterpieces by two of the greatest French composers at the beginning of the 20th century. Now, having said that, and having given you this list of 10 quartets to go and sink your teeth into, there are millions of string quartets, lots and lots and lots of them, and a lot of them by composers who are quite obscure, but who are very, very fine quartet composers. I mentioned Boccherini, who was a genius at quartet writing at the same time that Haydn was. There are also quartets at the beginning of the 19th century by people like Krummer and Onslow, and I mean, everybody was getting into it. And not everybody was great at it, but some people really were. So if you begin listening to string quartets and other chamber music, there is a limitless supply. I mean, there really is. There's just vast quantities of the stuff. And there are major series of quartets by 20th century composers like Shostakovich and Béla Bartók and Bohuslav Martinu. And I mean, I can go on and on with this. I really can. I don't want you to be intimidated. I want you to be looking forward to what you're going to encounter, because there is just no limit to this stuff and what it can express. So it's really worth your while to take some time, and I mean always, it's time. Listen to some of these works. Start following your own interests. Don't feel that you have to go for a particular group or time period or whatever, but we'll talk about some of these other ones too in other talks. But this is the essential list for beginners, a place to start. And we all have to start someplace. And I think this is a good one. So keep on listening, friends. Thank you so much for joining me. Take care.